The first tulip was yellow, its stem broken clean like it had been snapped with a purpose and not just trampled by the wind. He left it right in the center of the faded welcome mat, a single spot of impossible color against the worn gray bristles. Leo found it on a Tuesday, the morning after the first truly brutal night, the kind of night where the silence in his apartment didn't feel peaceful, but suffocating. He'd opened the door to let in the cold, damp air to maybe feel something other than the heavy, hollow ache in his own chest, and there it was, a perfect, silent offering. It became a ritual, as precise and reliable as the sunrise he never felt like watching anymore. Every morning for 3 weeks he'd open that heavy steel door, his hand still smelling of sleep and his heart doing its usual reluctant thump against his ribs, bracing for the day. And every morning, the cat was already gone, but his gift remained. A single tulip, sometimes red deep as a wound, sometimes pink, soft as a blush. Once a dramatic, almost black purple, its petals velvety and cool to the touch. They were always slightly damp with morning dew or a recent rain, and they were always placed with a strange formality, right in the dead center of the mat. Leo lived on the ground floor of a brick building that had probably been charming 60 years ago. Now it just felt tired. The kind of place where the pipes sang a mournful song all winter, and the light in the hallway always flickered, no matter how many times the super changed the bulb. His apartment was a testament to a life paused. Boxes were still stacked against one wall, not because he'd just moved in, but because he'd stopped unpacking. What was the point? The bed was too big for one person. The refrigerator hummed too loudly in the silence she used to fill. And then there was the cat. Leo hadn't seen him that first night, only heard him. A faint scuffling, a soft, weighty sigh, right outside the door. It was 3 a.m. The hour of ghosts and regrets. Leo was awake, of course. He was always awake then, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, tracing the same paths his mind always took, leading always to the same dark conclusion. He was alone. The sound was a welcome distraction. Something real, something now, not a memory. He'd held his breath, listening. It was a quiet, living sound. The sound of another creature just existing, breathing. It was a comfort somehow. He didn't get up. He didn't scare it away. He just listened until he fell into a fitful sleep and he woke to the first tulip. The cat was a gentleman, a tuxedo, black as a starless night with a pristine white chest, white paws that looked like he'd dipped them in fresh snow, and a perfectly symmetrical white smudge on his nose that gave him a permanently inquisitive look. He wasn't scrawny or desperate looking, like some strays. He was solid, well-built, with a broad head and eyes the color of old, polished pennies. He had a dignity about him, a quiet self-possession that felt at odds with his situation. He wasn't begging. He was visiting. His routine was unwavering. He'd appear just as the last of the daylight bled from the sky, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows under the rusted staircase across the courtyard. He'd pad silently across the cracked concrete, his white paws moving with a delicate precision. He never meowed, never scratched at the door. He'd just arrive, and he'd sit, not pressed against the door, not trying to get in, but about a foot back from it, sitting upright, his tail curled neatly around his feet, facing the world outside. He was a sentry, a guardian. Leo started waiting for him. The evening visit became the anchor of his day, the only thing he looked forward to. He'd turn off the too bright overhead light and turn on a small warm lamp by the window. He'd open the door just a crack, just enough to feel the exchange of air, to let the cat know he was there, that he was acknowledged. He'd sit on the floor, his back against the wall, and he'd just watch him. The cat would never look back, not directly. But his ears would twitch, the very tip of his tail would give the faintest flicker, an acknowledgement of the acknowledgement. "Hey, buddy," Leo would whisper into the dusk, his voice rough from disuse. The cat's shoulders would tighten almost imperceptibly, but he wouldn't run. He'd just settle in, a little statue of quiet vigilance. Leo began to wonder about the flowers. Where did a cat get tulips? This wasn't a neighborhood of manicured gardens. It was a neighborhood of chain-link fences and stubborn patches of weeds fighting through concrete. Was he stealing them from someone's patio planter? Raiding a trash can behind a florist? The logistics were baffling. And the consistency. Every single morning. It felt intentional. It felt like a message. One night it was raining. Not a gentle rain, but a cold, needle-sharp downpour that rattled the window panes and turned the courtyard into a shallow, muddy lake. Leo felt a pang of anxiety so sharp it surprised him. He peered out the peephole, but the world was a distorted, watery blur. He couldn't see the spot under the staircase. He cracked the door open, the wind immediately spraying his face with icy water. The courtyard was empty. Of course it was. No creature would be out in this. He felt a disappointment that was physically painful, a hollowing out in his gut. He'd come to rely on that silent company, on the simple, wordless proof that something in the world expected him to wake up in the morning. He closed the door, the click of the latch sounding final in the empty apartment. The silence felt heavier than ever, filled only by the drumming of the rain. He went to bed early just to stop waiting. The next morning, his heart was a stone in his chest as he approached the door. He didn't want to open it. He didn't want to see the empty mat, to have his fragile new ritual broken. He took a breath, turned the knob, and pulled. There, in the center of the soaked dark gray mat, was a single, brilliant red tulip. It was battered. A few petals were torn at the edges from the wind and rain. Water droplets clung to it like diamonds. But it was there, and a little ways away, sitting under the slight overhang of the roof, was the cat. He was soaked through, his fur plastered to his body, making him look smaller, vulnerable. He was shivering, a fine, constant tremor. But he was there. He looked up as Leo opened the door, his copper eyes blinking slowly. He didn't run. He just sat, dripping and patient, as if waiting to make sure his gift had been received. Leo's throat closed up. He looked from the bedraggled, beautiful flower to the shivering, dignified animal, and something deep inside him, something that had been frozen solid for months, cracked. Without thinking, he moved slowly, crouching down just inside the doorway, keeping a safe distance. "You're crazy," he whispered, his voice thick. "You crazy animal. You were out in all that?" The cat regarded him for a long moment. Then he did something he'd never done before. He slowly, deliberately closed. His eyes, not a blink, a long, slow, deliberate blink. He held them closed for a second, then opened them again, his gaze steady on Leo. It was a tiny thing, a nothing thing. But to Leo, in that moment, it felt like the first word of a conversation he didn't know he'd been waiting for. It felt like trust. He slowly mirrored the gesture, closing his own eyes, holding them shut, then opening them. The cat's ear twitched. He stood up, shook the water from his coat in one brisk, efficient motion, and turned to leave. But he paused at the edge of the walkway, glancing back just once over his shoulder, as if to say, "See you tomorrow," before disappearing into the damp morning. Leo picked up the rain-battered tulip. He held it carefully, like it was made of glass. He brought it inside, found a little juice glass, filled it with water, and placed the flower in it on the kitchen windowsill, next to the growing collection of its dried, papery predecessors. He looked at them, these daily silent gifts from a creature who asked for nothing. For the first time in a very long time, the morning felt different. Something had begun. He just didn't know it was already halfway over. You're here listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The world outside Leo's door began to change, not in any big, dramatic way, but in the slow, almost imperceptible shift of a season turning. The air, once sharp with the promise of winter, now carried the wet, earthy smell of thawing ground. The deep, solid puddles in the courtyard's cracks turned shallow and reflective, capturing pieces of the sky. And with this change, the rhythm of his life began to sync with the tuxedo cat's. Mornings were for the tulip. Evenings were for the vigil. Leo found himself structuring his day around it, the anxious, frantic energy that usually plagued him. From the moment he woke up, it was still there. A low hum under his skin, but now it had a place to go. It channeled into anticipation. He'd wake up and his first thought wouldn't be the crushing weight of the empty day ahead. It would be a quiet, what color will it be today? He'd make his coffee and carry it to the door, his breath held, for just a second before he turned the knob. The reveal of that spot of color against the gray mat became a daily sacrament, a small, silent prayer of gratitude offered to a creature he still didn't understand. Evenings were longer, drawn-out affairs. He'd come home from his job, a data entry position in a cubicle farm that felt light years away from this quiet, brick-lined world, and the first thing he'd do was shed his work clothes, the stiff fabric feeling like a costume. He'd pull on a soft, worn sweatshirt and a pair of jeans, and he'd wait. He'd watch the light fail through the window over his sink, the sky fading from a dull gray to a soft, bruised purple. And he'd listen. He learned the cat's sounds, the soft thump as he jumped down from the fence, the nearly silent crunch of his paws on the gravel path, the faint, almost inaudible sigh he made as he settled into his spot, a sound of pure, uncomplicated relief, as if this was the one place in the world he could finally relax his guard. Leo started leaving a blanket just inside the door, and he'd sit on it, his knees pulled up to his chest. The door opened just a sliver. He started talking, not in big, profound speeches, but in quiet, rambling monologues, spoken to the space between the door and the frame, where he knew the cat was listening. "Rough day today," he'd murmur one evening, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. "The guy in the cube next to me eats apples so loud. I think he does it on purpose. Who needs to crunch that much?" He'd pause, listening to the soft sound of the cat breathing outside. "It's stupid, I know. But you notice things like that when there's not much else to notice." Another night, the words came harder, sticking in his throat. "It would have been her birthday today," he said, the sentence feeling like broken glass in his mouth. He hadn't said it out loud to anyone. Who was there to tell? His parents, who lived 1,000 miles away and spoke in hushed, worried tones on the phone? His friends, who had slowly, understandably, drifted back to their own lives and their own partners? Saying it to the darkness, to the patient, silent creature on his porch, felt less like a confession and more like laying down a weight. "We'd always get this stupid, enormous cake from that bakery over on Carlton, the one with the pink boxes. It was too sweet. Always gave me a headache. But she loved it." He swallowed past the tightness in his throat. "I walked by there, today. The window was full of cupcakes with little hearts on them. For Valentine's, I guess." He stopped talking, just listening to the sound of a distant siren and the cat's steady, quiet presence. The cat didn't move. He didn't offer a meow of sympathy or rub against the door. He just was. He was a witness. And in that moment, that was everything. It was more than any hollow "I'm sorry" from a person could ever be. This was a shared silence, a recognized pain. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? Not because they want food or a scratch behind the ears, but just because you're there? It's a humbling thing. It chips away at the loneliness. It makes you feel chosen, in a way that's quiet and profound. Leo started to learn the cat's language. It was a lexicon of tiny movements, of subtle shifts in posture. The slow blink, which he now returned every night, was their "Hello. There. I see you and I mean no harm." A single twitch of the tip of his tail meant he'd heard a sound in the distance, a car door slamming 2 blocks away, a dog barking. A slight flattening of his ears meant he was feeling cautious. Maybe because the wind was kicking up an empty plastic bottle, sending it skittering across the pavement. And if he stood up, stretched his front legs out one at a time in a deep, deliberate bow, it meant his shift was over. It was time for him to go. One Friday, Leo took a risk. On his way home from work, he stopped at the grocery store. He walked past the apples and the bread and went straight to the pet aisle. It was a world of bright colors and smiling cartoon animals, a world he hadn't been a part of in a long time. He stood there for a good 10 minutes, just staring at the bags of kibble, the cans of wet food, the treats shaped like fish and chickens. He felt foolish. What was he doing? The cat wasn't his. The cat didn't ask for anything. Their entire relationship was built on the cat's silent generosity. Bringing food felt like payment. It felt like it might cheapen it. But then he thought of the cat sitting in the rain. He thought of the daily pilgrimage he must make to find these tulips. He saw a small bag of premium dry food, the kind with real salmon listed as the first ingredient. He bought it. He also bought a simple, sturdy ceramic bowl, dark blue. It felt like a commitment, buying a bowl. It was an object meant to stay. That evening, as the light began to fade, he did something different. He didn't just crack the door. He opened it. He stepped out onto the cold concrete of the small porch. The air had a bite to it, a metallic tang of lingering winter. The cat, who had just arrived and was in the process of his meticulous settling-in routine, froze. Every muscle in his body went taut. His head was up, his ears swiveled forward, his copper eyes wide and fixed on Leo. This was a breach of protocol. This was new. "Hey," Leo said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He moved slowly, like he was approaching a wild bird. He set the blue bowl down on the porch about 3 feet from where the cat stood frozen. He poured a small mound of the salmon kibble into it. The sound was loud in the quiet evening, a series of soft pats and clicks. The smell was strong, fishy, and rich. He didn't wait. He didn't watch to see if the cat would approach. That felt like pressure. He just turned and went back inside, leaving the door open the same 2 inches he always did. He sat down on his blanket, his heart hammering. Against his ribs, he'd scared him, he'd ruined it. He'd been greedy, wanting more, and he'd broken the fragile, beautiful thing they had. He listened. For a long time, there was nothing. Just the sound of the city breathing around them. Then a slight rustle, a cautious sniff. Leo held his breath. He could just see the edge of the bowl through the crack in the door. He saw a shadow move over it. He heard one single tentative crunch, then another, then a pause, then the sound of eating, steady and purposeful. Leo let out a breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding. He leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the first real, uncomplicated smile he'd felt in months. It felt strange on his face, like using a forgotten muscle. The next night, the cat arrived earlier than usual. Leo had just gotten home and was still taking his shoes off when he heard the soft thump outside. He opened the door. The cat was there, sitting, but not in his usual sentry position. He was closer to the door and he was looking right at it as if he'd been waiting. The blue bowl was licked clean. "You like that, huh?" Leo said, his voice warm. "Salmon guy. I should have known." He refilled the bowl. This time he stayed in the doorway leaning against the jamb. The cat watched him, his gaze flicking from Leo's face to the bowl and back again. He was wary, but the lure of the food was strong. He took a few cautious steps forward, his body low to the ground. He stopped a foot from the bowl, his eyes locked on Leo. He gave a low, quiet trill, a sound Leo had never heard him make before. It wasn't a meow. It was a question, a greeting. "It's okay," Leo murmured. "It's all for you." The cat seemed to think about this for a moment. Then he made his decision. He walked the last foot to the bowl with a newfound confidence and began to eat, his purr starting up so suddenly and so powerfully it was like a motor kicking on. It was a deep, rumbling, robust sound that seemed to vibrate through the porch, concrete and right up through the soles of Leo's feet. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated contentment. Leo didn't move. He just watched, listening to that incredible, healing sound. The cat ate his fill, then did something extraordinary. Instead of retreating to his usual spot to begin his watch, he sat down right where he was next to the empty bowl. He looked up at Leo, and then with a deliberate slowness that felt monumental, he turned his head and rubbed his cheek, his jaw, the entire side of his face against the corner of the blue ceramic bowl. It was a gesture of possession, of gratitude, of marking. This was his now. This place. This person. This was his. He then turned back to Leo, gave one more soft trill, and walked away into the gathering dark. His duty performed, his new ritual complete. Leo stood in the doorway for a long time after he was gone, the cold air washing over him, the rumble of that purr still echoing in his bones. The bond wasn't just forming anymore, it had been sealed, with a purr and a head rub and a bowl of salmon kibble. The fortress around Leo's heart had a permanent four-legged resident, and for the first time he was glad of it. The tulips kept coming. Every morning, without fail, a fresh one lay on the mat. But something had shifted. The easy rhythm they'd fallen into, the comfortable silence of their evenings, now had a new, discordant note running through it. A mystery. And it was tied directly to the cat's new strange habit. It started subtly. The cat would finish his dinner, purring his deep rumbling purr, and he'd perform his new ritual of rubbing his face against the blue bowl. He'd then settle into his sentry position, his back to Leo, facing the courtyard. For about an hour, all would be normal, the quiet companionship, the soft sounds of the night. But then, right around the time the last sliver of sun vanished and the streetlights hummed to life, he'd stand up. It wasn't the casual, stretching departure he used to make when his vigil was over. This was different. He'd go rigid, his head snapping up as if he'd heard a whistle only he could detect. His ears would pivot, scanning the frequency of the dusk. His tail would give one sharp, decisive flick, and then he'd be off. Not a lazy saunter, but a purposeful, low to the ground. A trot. He had somewhere to be. The first time it happened, Leo felt a jolt of surprise, then a pang of something that felt suspiciously like rejection. "Okay," he'd whispered to the now empty porch. "Guess you've got plans." He'd tried to laugh it off, but the apartment felt suddenly colder, emptier. The cat had a life beyond this porch. Of course he did. He wasn't a pet. He was a free agent. But the thought was unexpectedly painful. The disappearances became part of the routine. Leo would watch him go, a black and white ghost melting into the shadows between the buildings, heading in the same direction every time, east, toward the older, more residential part of the neighborhood, where the houses had small, fenced-in yards instead of concrete courtyards. He'd be gone for exactly 2 hours. Leo knew because he started timing it, watching the slow crawl of the clock on his microwave with a gnawing sense of anxiety. 7:15 p.m., departure. 9:15 p.m., return. And when he returned, he was different. The proud, dignified posture was gone. He'd come back looking worn, trudging instead of trotting. His fur, usually so immaculate, would be dusty, sometimes with a stray cobweb clinging to his whiskers or a tiny leaf stuck to his white chest. His paws would be faintly damp, smelling of soil and night. He'd amble back onto the porch, often not even looking at Leo, and collapse into a tired heap, not in his sentry position but right next to the door, as if he'd used the very last of his energy just to make it back. He'd curl up, tuck his nose under his tail, and fall into a deep, immediate sleep, his breathing heavy and slow. Leo's worry began to curdle into a quiet, constant fear. Where was he going? What was he doing that left him so exhausted? Was he getting into fights? Was there another person, another home he was visiting? The thought was a cold knot in Leo's stomach. Maybe he wasn't special. Maybe this cat had a whole circuit of lonely people he visited, leaving them trinkets and accepting their offerings of food. The idea felt like a betrayal, even though he knew it was irrational. The cat owed him nothing. The gifts began to change too. It was no longer just the pristine, perfectly placed tulip. Now sometimes there would be something else left alongside it. Small, strange, heartbreaking tokens. A grubby, much-chewed hair tie. The elastic stretched out and speckled with tooth marks. A single, brown-edged button that looked like it had come from a child's coat. A piece of blue and green sea glass worn smooth by the ocean miles from any beach. Once a faded, water-stained photograph, curled at the edges showing the smiling face of a little girl with pigtails. her image blurred by time and weather. These objects felt different from the tulips. The tulips were beautiful, intentional, like a purchased gift. These felt like treasures, the cat's personal treasures, things he had found and kept and loved. And he was leaving them for Leo. Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? Not in the abstract, but in a real, visceral way? Do they sense the hollow places inside us and try to fill them with whatever they have? This felt like that. It felt like the cat was rummaging through his own soul, finding the things he valued most and laying them at Leo's feet as an offering. It was the most profound gesture of connection Leo had ever experienced, and it terrified him. It felt like a goodbye. It felt like the cat was giving away his prized possessions. The fear became a constant companion, sharper than the loneliness had ever been. Every evening as 7:15 approached, Leo's chest would grow tight. He'd watch the cat, willing him to just stay, to break the pattern. "You don't have to go," he'd whisper, his hand resting on the cool steel of the door. But the cat always did. The invisible whistle would blow and duty would call him away. One night it was raining again, a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked everything and made the world look smeared and bleak. The cat finished his dinner and went through the now familiar routine, the face rub, the settling in. Leo's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. "Please don't go. Not tonight. Just stay." He watched the clock. 7:10, 7:12, 7:14. The cat stood up. He went rigid. His head snapped up. Leo's breath caught. "Don't," he said, the word escaping as a plea. The cat's ears twitched. He turned his head and looked directly at Leo through the crack in the door. His copper eyes seemed to hold a universe of sadness, of unshakable obligation. He gave a single slow blink, an apology, a promise. And then he was gone, vanishing into the wet, dark curtain of rain. The 2-hour wait was agony. Leo couldn't sit still. He paced the length of his small apartment, his anxiety a live wire under his skin. The rain tapped a frantic, nervous rhythm on the window pane. He imagined the cat cold, hurt, lost. He imagined him in a fight with another animal, cornered and scared. He imagined him finding a warmer, drier porch with a more generous person, and simply not coming back. Each scenario played out in his mind in vivid, horrifying detail. At 9:05, 10 minutes early, a shape emerged from the gloom. It was moving slowly, dragging itself through the puddles. Leo's heart plummeted. He yanked the door open, the cold rain hitting him in the face. The cat was a pitiful sight. He was soaked through again, but this was different from the last time. He wasn't just wet, he was filthy. Mud was caked on his belly and legs, splattered up his sides. He was limping, favoring his front right paw, holding it up and away from the ground. He looked up at Leo, and his expression wasn't just tired. It was defeated. He didn't have a tulip with him. He didn't have one of his little treasures. He had nothing. He just hobbled past Leo into the dry, warm light of the apartment and walked, leaving a trail of muddy paw prints and dripping water on the floorboards. He went straight to the corner where Leo's blanket was folded, collapsed onto it with a soft, pained grunt, and began to lick gingerly at his injured paw. Leo stood frozen in the open doorway, the rain blowing in, soaking the welcome mat. The cat had never come inside before, never even tried. This was a line that had never been crossed. The broken routine, the injury, the utter exhaustion, it was all wrong. The mystery was no longer a curious puzzle. It was a crisis. Something was happening to his friend. Something was hurting him. And as Leo looked at the trail of mud leading to the shivering, wounded animal on his blanket, he knew the time for quiet observation was over. The fear had finally been eclipsed by a need so fierce it stole the air from his lungs. He had to know. He had to follow. Tomorrow, he would find out where the cat went, no matter what. The night was the longest of Leo's life. He didn't sleep. He sat on the floor a few feet from the blanket, watching the cat breathe. The steady, deep rhythm of his sleep was occasionally broken by a twitch, a faint whimper, a shudder that ran through his muddy fur. Each sound was a knife in Leo's chest. He'd brought a bowl of water and a clean, damp cloth, and he'd gently, so gently, wiped the mud from the cat's paws and belly. The right paw was swollen, hot to the touch, but there was no cut, no visible wound. Maybe a sprain. Maybe he'd jumped down wrong from a fence. The not knowing was its own special kind of torture. The cat woke just before dawn. He stirred, lifted his head, and looked around the unfamiliar room with wide, disoriented eyes. They landed on Leo, and a flicker of recognition passed through them, followed by what looked like embarrassment. He quickly began grooming his chest, licking at the spots where the mud had been, trying to restore his dignity. He tried to stand, winced, and settled back down with a resigned sigh. "It's okay," Leo whispered, his voice raspy from the sleepless night. "You can stay." The cat looked at him, then at the door. The usual morning ritual, the tulip. A kind of panic flashed in his eyes. He tried to stand again, more determined, this time ignoring the pain. "No," Leo said more firmly. He moved closer slowly and placed a hand on the blanket, not on the cat, but near him. "You're hurt. Just rest. It's okay." The cat stared at him, his gaze intense, almost pleading. He let out a small, frustrated sound, a mix of a meow and a sigh. He understood. He knew he was too hurt to go. And it was clearly devastating. Him. This wasn't just a habit. It was an obligation. A compulsion. That was the moment Leo's plan crystallized. It wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about protection. This creature, who had given him back pieces of himself he thought were lost forever, was in some kind of silent, desperate trouble. And Leo was going to find out what it was. He waited until the cat, exhausted from pain and frustration, fell back into a fitful sleep. Then he moved. He dressed in dark, quiet clothes. He found a small flashlight. He left a fresh mound of food and a full bowl of water next to the blanket. He paused at the door, looking back at the sleeping animal. "I'm going to figure this out," he promised, his voice low and fierce, "and just hang on." He took up his position across the courtyard, hidden in the deep shadows under the rusted staircase where the cat used to wait. The air was cold and still, the sky a flat, dull gray. The world felt hushed, holding its breath. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, a mix of fear and a grim, determined resolve. He was going to follow him. Not tonight, but right now. He was going to retrace the path the cat took every evening. He was going to find the source of the tulips and the exhaustion and the pain. The walk east felt like moving through a dream. This was the path he'd watched the cat take dozens of times, a silent pilgrimage into a part of the neighborhood Leo rarely had reason to visit. It was a street of older, slightly weary-looking clapboard houses, each with a small, proud yard, fighting a losing battle against weeds and neglect. The air smelled different here. Less of concrete and car exhaust, more of damp earth, old leaves, and the faint, sweet smell of blooming things. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the ground, the fences, the yards, looking for any sign, any clue. A broken branch on a fence. A tuft of black and white fur caught on a rough wooden post. He felt like a detective, piecing together the secret life of his mysterious friend. And then he saw them. Tulips. Behind a chain-link fence, in the yard of a small, pale blue house that needed a new coat of paint, was a garden. It wasn't a big, showy garden, but a small, meticulously tended plot right up against the house's foundation. And it was full of tulips, a riot of them. Reds, yellows, pinks, purples, whites. They stood in proud, perfect rows, their colors vibrant against the dull brown of the mulched soil. This was it. This had to be it. His pulse hammered in his ears. He approached the fence slowly, his hand closing around the cold metal links. He looked at the house. The curtains were drawn. It looked quiet, still, empty. His eyes swept over the garden, and that's when he saw the disruptions. In the neat, orderly rows, there were gaps. Empty spaces where a tulip should have been. And not just old, harvested gaps. Fresh ones. The earth around them was dark and damp, recently disturbed. He could see the clean, sharp cut of a stem left behind. He followed the line of the fence toward the back of the yard. And there, partly hidden behind an overgrown rhododendron bush, was a small, cat-sized hole dug under the fence. The dirt was freshly turned, and pressed into the mud was a familiar, unmistakable paw print. Leo's breath caught. It was one thing, to suspect it. It was another to see the evidence. The cat was a thief, a beautiful, devoted flower thief. He was stealing these tulips one every morning and bringing them to Leo. The sheer impossible audacity of it left him dizzy. The risk he took every single day slipping into this yard, choosing his flower, snapping the stem, and carrying it home. But why? Why this house? Why these tulips? He was so focused on the garden and the hole under the fence that he almost missed it. A movement at the side of the house, a flash of black and white. His heart leapt into his throat. The cat? But no, he was back home, asleep on the blanket. He squinted. It was a different cat, a smaller one, sleeker, also a tuxedo, sitting on the windowsill of a slightly open basement window. It was watching him with wary green eyes. As Leo stared, another small head popped up beside the first. A tiny kitten, its fur a smudgy gray, peering out at the world. Then another. A whole family of cats using that basement window as a secret entrance. A cold dread began to pool in Leo's stomach. This wasn't just a garden. This was a colony. The cat wasn't just visiting a garden. He was interacting with other cats. Was this where he went at night? Was this his real family? The thought was a physical blow. He leaned against the fence, the metal cold against his forehead, trying to catch his breath. The mystery was deepening, twisting into something he hadn't expected. He needed to see more. He needed to understand. The driveway led to a gate that opened into the backyard. The latch was old, rusted shut. Without allowing himself to think, without considering the consequences, he put a hand on the gate and lifted hard. It jerked open with a screech of protesting metal that sounded explosively loud in the quiet morning. He froze, waiting for a light to come on, for a door to open, for a shout. Nothing. The house remained dark and silent. He slipped through the gate and into the backyard. The yard was wilder than the front, less tended. The tulip garden gave way to overgrown grass and neglected flower beds. And that's when he saw the full extent of it. There were cat dishes everywhere. Not just one or two, but a dozen of them, scattered on the porch, under bushes, by the back, steps. Some were plastic, some were ceramic, all were filled with water or the faded, dried remnants of old food. A large, covered Rubbermaid bin sat near the back door, its lid askew, revealing a huge bag of dry cat food inside. This wasn't just a house with a few cats. This was a sanctuary, or a horde. The line between the two felt thin and terrifying. His eyes were drawn back to the basement window. The cats had vanished inside. The window was open just a crack, enough for a cat to slip through. An impulse, reckless and undeniable, took hold of him. He had to see. He had to know. He crossed the damp grass, his shoes sinking into the soft earth. He knelt down in front of the window well. It was filled with dead leaves. The window itself was old, the wood frame rotten in one corner. He hooked his fingers under the bottom edge of the window and pulled. It slid up another few inches with a gritty scraping sound. The smell that wafted out stopped his heart. It wasn't a bad smell. It was the smell of old books, of lavender sachets, of dust and time. And underneath it all, faint but unmistakable, was the antiseptic metallic smell of a hospital room. The smell of sickness. His breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. He fumbled for his flashlight, his hands trembling so badly he almost dropped it. He clicked it on. aimed the beam into the darkness and peered inside. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a basement that was part storage, part living space. There were boxes stacked high, old furniture draped with white sheets like sleeping ghosts. And in the corner, not 10 feet from the window, was a bed. A proper hospital bed, with metal rails and a crank at the end. And in the bed, propped up, on pillows, was an old woman. She was asleep, her mouth slightly open, her face pale and etched with deep lines. Her hair, a wispy cloud of white, was spread out on the pillow. Her hands, resting on top of the floral quilt, were thin, almost translucent, the veins standing out like blue rivers on a map. The beam of Leo's flashlight trembled over her face, and he quickly pointed it away, his heart hammering with a violent, guilty panic. But the light had already shown him everything else. On a small table next to the bed was a water glass with a bent straw, a box of tissues, and a small framed photograph. Even from this distance, even in the shaky beam of the flashlight, Leo recognized the little girl with pigtails. It was the same photograph the cat had left on his welcome mat, and there on the quilt, right next to her frail hand, was a cat. It was the smaller tuxedo cat he'd seen in the window. It was curled up, purring, its head resting gently on the woman's wrist. Watching over her, Leo understood. All of it. The pieces crashed together in his mind with the force of a physical blow. The tulips weren't for him, not really. They were from her garden. The cat wasn't bringing him gifts. He was bringing him pieces of her. He was a messenger, a caretaker. His nightly vigil wasn't an abandonment. It was a shift change. He came to Leo for food and companionship, but his real duty, his sacred obligation, was here, in this basement. Watching over this dying woman, the exhaustion, the mud, the injured paw, it all made sense. He was working himself to the bone, trying to care for everyone. For her, for the other cats, for Leo. A sound escaped Leo's throat, a choked half-sob. He stumbled back from the window, falling onto the damp grass. The world swam, tears blurring his vision. He'd had it all wrong. This whole time, he'd thought the cat was a stray, who had chosen him. But he wasn't a stray. He had a home. He had a person. He was the most devoted creature Leo had ever encountered, and he was breaking his heart trying to hold his entire world together. He thought of the cat rubbing his face against the blue bowl, claiming it. He thought of the slow blinks, the trills, the purrs. It wasn't just affection, it was gratitude. Leo was helping him. He was a source of strength, a place to refuel so he could continue his real work. His important work. Leo didn't know how long he sat there in the cold grass, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He finally pushed himself to his feet, his legs weak. He had to get home. He had to be there when the cat woke up. He slipped back out the gate, latching it quietly behind him. The walk home was a blur. The world looked different. The colors seemed sharper, the air clearer. He felt humbled, shattered, and filled with a new, profound sense of purpose. He opened his apartment door. The cat was still asleep on the blanket, but he stirred as Leo entered. He lifted his head, his copper eyes blinking slowly. He looked at Leo standing there in his muddy shoes, his face probably streaked with tears. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look alarmed. He just looked knowing. He slowly, carefully, pushed himself up onto his 3 good paws. He limped across the floorboards, each step a small effort. He didn't stop until he was right in front of Leo. He looked up, held his gaze for a long, silent moment, and then he did it. He leaned forward, and with infinite care he pressed the top of his head, the spot right between his ears, firmly into Leo's palm. It was more than a gesture of trust. It was a transfer, a silent plea, a shared understanding. It was the cat finally saying, without words, what he had been trying to tell him all along. I need your help. She needs our help. Leo finally saw. The message had been delivered. The storm of understanding didn't pass. It settled. It became the new weather inside Leo's heart. a constant, gentle rain that washed away the dust of his old grief and let something new and tender grow in its place. Nothing was the same after that morning in the overgrown backyard. The world had been tilted on its axis, and everything had slid into a new, sharper, more meaningful alignment. The cat. Leo finally learned his name was Arthur, from a faded tag, on a collar he must have only worn when on his official duties, which he now sometimes did. Never explained himself. He didn't need to. His language had always been one of action, of quiet devotion, and now Leo had learned to speak it back. Their routine evolved. It was no longer just about waiting and receiving. It was a partnership. Mornings still began with a tulip on the mat, but now Leo was usually already awake, waiting with a small pair of scissors. He'd chosen a deep crimson one the day after his discovery, cutting it cleanly at the stem and placing it in a slender vase he'd bought from the thrift store. He'd bring it inside, set it on the windowsill, and then prepare 2 bowls. One of premium salmon kibble for Arthur, and one of soft, wet food for him to carry. The walk to the pale blue house became their new morning ritual. Arthur would lead the way, his limp almost entirely gone now, his pace steady and purposeful. He'd slip through the hole under the fence and Leo would unlatch the gate, his presence now an open secret. He'd fill the scattered bowls with fresh food and water, his movements calm and reverent. The other cats, a small colony of 4, plus the 2 skittish kittens, would watch from a distance, their green eyes glowing from under the porch or behind the rhododendron bush. They never came close, but they accepted his offerings. They knew he was with Arthur. That made him safe. He never tried to go inside again. That boundary felt sacred. But he'd peer through the basement window every morning just to check. The old woman, whose name he learned was Alara, was always sleeping. Sometimes a younger woman, a nurse or a caretaker with a tired, kind face would be there, adjusting her pillows or smoothing her blanket. Leo would just watch for a moment, ensuring the rhythm of care was uninterrupted, then retreat quietly back to the yard. His afternoons were for Alara too, but in a different way. He started tending her tulip garden. He bought a small trowel and gardening gloves. He weeded the meticulous rows, careful not to disturb the bulbs. He watered them in the evening, the spray from the hose catching the light like 1,000 falling diamonds. He felt connected to her through the soil, through the vibrant life of the flowers she had planted. He was caring for something she loved, preserving a beauty she could no longer tend to herself. It was his silent vigil, his way of saying, "I see you too." Arthur's life was now split cleanly between 2 homes, 2 people who needed him in different ways. His evenings were still for Alara. He'd vanish at 7:15, a creature of unshakable habit, and spend his night on her quilt, a living, breathing comfort. But his nights were now for Leo. He'd return not at 9:15, but later, often after midnight. Slipping through the door Leo now left open for him with a makeshift pet door he'd installed. He'd pad into the bedroom, jump up on the bed, a privilege he'd granted himself, and curl into a tight purring ball against Leo's side. His weight, his warmth, the rumble of his contentment became the anchor that finally let Leo sleep through the night. The 3 a.m. ghosts were chased away by the sound of one small, steady breath. Leo's apartment was no longer a place of paused life. The boxes were unpacked. The photos of her, of Sarah, were back on the walls, not as instruments of pain, but as honored memories. He could look at her smile now and feel a flicker of its warmth, not just the cold absence behind it. Arthur had done that. He hadn't replaced the love Leo had lost. He had simply shown him that his heart was capable of holding more than one kind. That love wasn't a finite resource, but a well that could be refilled by the most unexpected of companions. The seasons turned. The brilliant tulips bloomed, blazed with color, and then slowly began to fade, their petals dropping one by one onto the mulch below. Leo deadheaded them carefully, knowing they'd return next spring. The air grew heavy and warm with the promise of summer. One morning, the pattern broke. Leo was in the garden, watering. Arthur was sitting nearby, meticulously washing a paw, his sentry duty relaxed in the safe, familiar space. The back door of the blue house opened. It wasn't the caretaker. It was a man, maybe in his 50s, with Alara's pale eyes and a kind, weary face. He looked at Leo, then at the well-tended garden, then at Arthur sitting contentedly nearby. "Oh," the man said, his voice soft with surprise. "You're the one." Leo straightened up, his heart skipping a beat. He felt caught, an intruder, exposed. I'm sorry, I was just... The garden looked like it could use..." The man held up a hand, a gentle smile touching his lips. "No, please don't apologize, I'm Ben. Alara is my mother." He stepped out onto the porch, closing the door quietly behind him. "I've seen you from the window. And Arthur, he's been less frantic lately. He comes home smelling of salmon, not alleyways." He looked at Leo, his gaze curious and deeply grateful. "It's you, isn't it? You've been feeding him, taking care of him." Leo nodded, the words sticking in his throat. "His name is Arthur?" Ben's smile widened. "My mother named him. After the king. She said he had a noble heart." He looked out over the garden, his eyes growing misty. "He never left her side, you know. Not until... recently. We thought he'd run away for good, but he'd just come back exhausted every night without fail. We couldn't figure it out. He was coming to me," Leo said, the truth feeling both heavy and light as he finally spoke it aloud. He's been looking after me too, I think." The two men stood in silence for a moment, a strange and beautiful understanding passing between them. They were two ends of a chain of care, connected by a small black and white creature with a noble heart. "She's gone, you know," Ben said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "Last night. Very peacefully. Arthur was right there with her." The words should have felt like an ending, but to Leo they felt like a completion. A circle, finally closed with grace and love. He looked at Arthur, who had stopped his washing, and was watching them both, his copper eyes wise and ancient. He had stayed until the very end. He had fulfilled his oath. "I'm so sorry," Leo said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "Thank you," Ben replied. He took a deep, shaky breath. The hospice nurse said, "She said sometimes the ones who are leaving, they send comfort ahead to the ones who will be left behind. They can't always say goodbye themselves, so they send a messenger." He looked at Arthur, his expression one of pure, undiluted wonder. "I think he was her messenger." Leo's eyes filled with tears. He thought of the first yellow tulip arriving on the morning after his worst night. A spot of color in the gray. A message he was too numb to understand. There is still beauty. "Hold on." Ben visited again. A week later. The house was quiet, filled with the gentle sadness of sorting through a life. He brought a box with him. Inside were a few of Alara's things, her favorite lavender sachets, a book of poetry with her notes in the margins, and a small clay pot with a single thriving tulip bulb, dug carefully from her garden. "She'd want you to have this," Ben said, handing the pot to Leo. "She loved those flowers more than anything. And there's this too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a familiar, grubby, much-chewed hair tie. Arthur must have stolen this from her nightstand 100 times. She always said it was his way of playing. I think he was trying to bring a piece of her to you." Leo took the hair tie, the simple, silly object feeling like a sacred relic. It was the final gift, not from Arthur, from Alara, through Arthur. A relay of compassion that had stretched from a sunlit garden to a dark basement to a lonely porch, connecting three souls who never would have met. That evening, Arthur didn't leave at 7:15. He sat on the porch watching the night settle in. He seemed lighter. His work was done. His queen was safe. He looked at Leo, gave a slow, deliberate blink, and walked inside, his home now for good. Leo placed the clay pot on his kitchen windowsill, next to the vase that held that day's tulip. He looked at the trail of mud Arthur had left on the floorboards that night he'd first come inside. A trail that had led them here to this moment of quiet, enduring peace. The love he'd thought was lost had never left. It had just changed its shape, arriving not with a knock on the door, but with a flower on the mat, delivered by a king. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.